Hey guys, this is video 2 about the Bible. As I said in the first one, where you will also find the detailed content, some of these videos will cover important truths about the Bible, 5 main ones, and also 8 common lies. Then the following videos will cover supernatural characteristics and the opposition you may have to overcome if you decide to read or study it. Now, the first truth was about the Bible miraculous history, the way it was written. Check it out on my channel if you haven't seen the video. The second one is the fact that the Bible has an astonishing number of prophecies fulfilled so far. This part I think will amaze you. Even more than how the book was written. And this is not just entirely true, but honestly, in some regards, quite shocking, I would say. The science-related ones, for example, about the Earth, about radio waves, about medicine, about the ocean, about how to build ships, about quarantine. I'll try to briefly cover some of them in this video, and then the following one will talk about the same thing. Wait until you see what the Bible said about the quarantine way before it was applied, actually. Up until this year, 2020, the Bible has already hundreds of prophecies fulfilled. In fact, scholars say that only the prophecies about Jesus, more than 300, all came true. And all were written about 1,000 years before he was born. This topic is so vast that it would take several documentaries to cover, so please bear with me. I'll just give a few examples. The Bible prophesies when Jesus would be born, where he would be born, when and how he would be born. It also predicted how he would die. 1,000 years before Jesus died, King David of Israel described Jesus' death on the cross in one of his psalms. That would be long before the Romans were thinking about crucifying people. In fact, long before crucifixion was even invented by the Persians. Yet David actually described it. In the Old Testament, the prophet Zacharias also writes about the crucifixion of Christ. He says, "They shall look upon him whom they have pierced." Same for Isaiah, who lived 700 years before the birth of Christ and who describes in detail the suffering Christ would go through. Same for Micah in chapter 5 verse 2, who talks about the place where Jesus would be born and mentions the importance of his arrival into the world. Would you consider these as natural, normal writings? But wait, there is more. What about mentioning centuries before, not one or two events, but the exact evolution of an entire empire? The book of Daniel, written in the late 500 before Christ, talks about a massive empire that will come into being and how that empire will be divided into 4. These 4 would emerge into 2, and the 2 blend into 1. 200 years later, year 300 before Christ, this is exactly what happened. Alexander the Great, his empire was cut short when he died, and his kingdom was divided between his 4 generals, apparently. Those 4 blending into 2, the Ptolemaic and Seleucid empires, that emerged into 1, the Roman Empire. Do you have any other example of such specificity in any other book? And can anyone explain this kind of accuracy? To wrap it up, and as briefly as possible, scholars mention over 300 prophecies fulfilled only about Jesus, without counting the others about world empires, the evolution of Israel, or different other people. Yet remember what I said at the beginning of this series about how this book was written. Basically by folks who in majority didn't know each other, and over a time span of more than 1500 years. Again, see video 1 about the Bible on my channel. So not just that this book agrees on all of these topics despite the way it was written, but it also includes hundreds of prophecies already fulfilled. What do you think are the mathematical odds for this happening? It would be reasonable to say that all this is basically light years beyond the realm of human possibility. For all of you who like logic, wouldn't you also agree with me when I say that it takes a lot more faith to believe that these were mere coincidences. But wait, there is much more. Now let's talk about science. You'll be amazed about this one. We will get back to it, to this point later, and from a different perspective. Here are some scientific facts that the Bible revealed long before humanity even discovered them. The earth. When people believed the earth was sustained somehow by another object or being, the Bible, 1500 years before Christ, in the book of Job, says that the earth floats into space. It says, He hangs the earth on nothing, Job 26:7. Science didn't discover that the earth hangs on nothing until the year 1650, basically 3,000 years later. Also, the book of Isaiah in chapter 40 verse 22 talks about the earth being round. God sits above the circle of the earth. It was written sometime between 740 and 680 before Christ. Pythagoras launched his idea around 500 before Christ, and then Aristotle, both famous Greek philosophers, determined that the earth was a sphere based on studies of the moon, apparently eclipses and ships, but only around the year 350 before Christ. Basically some hundreds years later than the Bible. About medicine now. Wait until you hear this one. Encyclopedia Britannica documents that in 1845, a young doctor in Vienna called Ignaz Semmelweis, I apologize if I'm not pronouncing his name right, was horrified at the death rate of women who gave birth in hospitals. As many as 30% died after childbirth, because the doctors examining the dead bodies were then going on to the next patient without washing their hands. That was their normal practice, believe it or not. So this doctor insisted that all medical staff should wash hands before examining any patient, which made that rate go down to 2% from 30%. Look now to the Bible. Look to its instructions to the Hebrew nations about 3,000 years ago when it comes to dealing with disease. This is written in Leviticus 15:13, where God instructs his people to wash their hands under running water. When the man with the discharge is healed, he must count off 7 days for the period of purification. Then he must wash his clothes and bathe himself in fresh water, and he will be ceremonially clean. So 3,000 years before. Now doctors do wash their hands in running water, thanks God, but not too long ago they did so in a bowl of still water, leaving invisible germs on their hands. Another one from medicine. The book of Leviticus, again, chapter 17:11, says that information is in the blood. It says that the life of the flesh is in the blood. Or some other translations say the life of the body is in the blood. Today we all know that any doctor can find out about our whole health from a sample of our blood, right? But up until a couple of 100 years or so ago, people were actually bled in order to be healed. And many died because of this very cruel practice. And now we know that people, of course, need blood, so we give them transfusions and rather than removing their blood to heal them. But more than 1,000 years before Christ, the Bible actually talked about this. And there is so much more, but to keep it short, I'll stop here for now. The next one is about quarantine. If the Bible teachings had been applied, they would have saved millions of people. And we will also talk about sea currents, about ships, and so on. Honestly, the Bible is not just an amazing book, but it can totally change you. It can totally change your life if you start investigating it yourself. So until the next time, have a blessed life.